Have you ever wondered how a company can survive wars, economic collapses, and generations of changing consumer tastes, only to unravel in a matter of weeks? For more than a century, one American candy maker seemed untouchable. Its products filled general stores, movie theaters, pharmacies, and school lunchboxes from coast to coast. Every Valentine's Day, billions of tiny candy hearts carrying messages like "Be Mine," "Kiss Me," and "True Love" appeared on store shelves, becoming as much a part of the holiday as roses themselves. At its height, the New England Confectionery Company, better known as NECCO, was an industrial powerhouse. Its enormous factory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, produced roughly 4 billion candy wafers every year and more than 8 billion conversation hearts annually. The company controlled around 40% of America's wafer candy market, employed over 2,400 people, and operated inside an 820,000 square foot manufacturing complex that rarely fell silent. Its reach extended far beyond candy stores. During the Second World War, the U.S. government ordered millions of NECCO wafers for military rations because they were lightweight, durable, and could survive conditions that would ruin ordinary sweets. For generations of Americans, NECCO wasn't simply another candy brand. It was part of everyday life. Then, almost unbelievably, everything collapsed. By 2018, the same factory that had produced billions of candies each year stood eerily quiet. The machinery that had powered one of America's oldest manufacturers was sold at auction for a fraction of its value. A business that had endured the Civil War, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and more than 170 years of economic change fell apart in less than 90 days. Revenue that had once reached approximately $230 million gave way to bankruptcy and liquidation. For the first time in well over a century, the iconic conversation hearts disappeared from store shelves before Valentine's Day, leaving millions of Americans wondering how such a familiar tradition had simply vanished. This is not merely the story of a candy company. It is the story of how innovation created an empire, how success slowly bred complacency, and how decades of poor decisions, neglect, and corporate mismanagement eventually destroyed a business that once seemed impossible to kill. It is a case study in what happens when a company's greatest strength, its history, gradually becomes its greatest weakness. To understand that collapse, we have to go back to where it all began. Boston, Massachusetts, 1847. Inside a small apothecary shop on Winter Street, a 23-year-old English immigrant named Oliver Chase spends his days producing medicinal lozenges by hand. He arrived in America only 3 years earlier, with little money, no influential connections, and few opportunities. Like countless immigrants of the era, he relied almost entirely on hard work. There was just one problem. Making lozenges was painfully inefficient. Every batch required the dough to be rolled by hand, cut piece by piece, and individually stamped before it could be sold. Producing only a few dozen lozenges could consume hours of exhausting labor. The work demanded patience more than skill, leaving workers with aching backs, sore hands, and very little to show for the effort. Most people accepted that this was simply how the trade worked. Oliver Chase didn't. Where others saw routine, he saw wasted time. Where others accepted tradition, he saw an engineering problem waiting to be solved. After closing the shop each evening, he remained behind, experimenting with mechanical designs instead of medicines. His goal wasn't to invent a better lozenge, it was to reinvent the entire manufacturing process. The idea was ambitious. One machine capable of flattening the mixture, cutting perfectly uniform pieces, and stamping each lozenge in a single continuous operation. To many experienced pharmacists, the concept sounded unrealistic. Handmade production had defined the business for decades, and few believed a machine could replace skilled labor. Chase ignored the skepticism. In 1847, his persistence paid off. He completed what became known as the lozenge cutting machine, a hand-cranked device equipped with rollers to flatten the dough, blades to slice it into identical discs, and stamps to imprint every piece as it passed through. The improvement was extraordinary. Tasks that once consumed hours could now be completed in minutes. Production became faster, more consistent, and dramatically less dependent on manual craftsmanship. A single operator could accomplish work that previously required multiple skilled workers. The impact was immediate. Word spread quickly throughout Boston. Pharmacists wanted the machine. Confectioners wanted the products it produced. Chase suddenly found himself operating more efficiently than virtually anyone else in the country. Within just a few years, the implications became impossible to ignore. By 1850, Oliver Chase recognized that his future no longer lay in pharmaceuticals. His invention had opened the door to something far larger. In 1866, Oliver's brother, Daniel Chase, joined the business. The two brothers couldn't have been more different. Oliver approached every challenge like an engineer, focused on machinery, efficiency, and production. Daniel thought like a marketer, long before the term even existed. He believed candy could be more than something people ate. It could become something they shared. That idea led to another remarkable invention. Daniel developed a printing machine capable of stamping short messages directly onto candy using vegetable-based dye. Suddenly, a simple sugar wafer carried a personality of its own. Instead of plain sweets, customers were buying tiny edible notes filled with affection, humor, and courtship. The first versions looked nothing like the famous candies we recognize today. They featured longer Victorian-era phrases such as, "Married in white, you have chosen right," "How long shall I have to wait?" and "Please be considerate." They were sold through pharmacies, general stores, and neighborhood candy shops, particularly during the Valentine season. Consumers embraced the idea almost immediately. The product wasn't successful because of its flavor alone. It succeeded because it gave people a new way to express emotions. Long before text messages or greeting cards became everyday conveniences, these little candies allowed someone to send a message that was playful, romantic, and memorable. By 1901, Daniel refined the concept once again. The rectangular lozenges evolved into the familiar heart shape that would become one of the most recognizable candies in American history. The messages became shorter, simpler, and instantly recognizable. "Be mine," "Kiss me," "True love." With that redesign, the conversation heart stopped being just another seasonal novelty. It became synonymous with Valentine's Day itself. Every February, demand surged across the country. And because the Chase brothers were the only manufacturers producing them at scale, they weren't simply leading a category. They had effectively created one. As demand continued to grow, another opportunity emerged. By the end of the 19th century, Boston had become one of America's busiest confectionery centers. Dozens of candy manufacturers fought aggressively for customers, suppliers, and retail space. Competition drove prices lower, squeezed profits, and forced companies into constant battles for survival. For business owners, endless competition wasn't a sign of a healthy market. It was becoming an expensive problem. Rather than continue fighting one another, several of Boston's largest candy manufacturers chose a different strategy. Chase & Company joined forces with Wright and Moody and the Forbes Candy Company. Instead of operating as rivals, they pooled factories, combined distribution systems, and shared manufacturing resources under one organization. By the 1940s, NECCO controlled roughly 40% of America's wafer candy market. Conversation Hearts had become an annual manufacturing marathon. Every year, months before Valentine's Day arrived, the Cambridge factory shifted into overdrive, producing more than 8 billion candy hearts. Workers packed them into boxes by the millions, while trucks carried shipments to virtually every corner of the United States, from Boston to Los Angeles, from Seattle to Miami. The tiny candy hearts had become a national tradition. As one decade passed into another, the company seemed almost untouchable. Sales remained strong. Its reputation only grew. The factory became a local landmark, attracting visitors and serving as a source of pride for generations of employees who spent entire careers inside its walls. For more than a century, NECCO appeared to have discovered the secret every manufacturer dreams of: lasting relevance. But beneath that remarkable stability, the market was quietly changing. By the early 1960s, American consumers no longer wanted the same kinds of candy they had loved generations earlier. Chocolate sales were booming. Bright fruit flavors were gaining popularity. Companies like Hershey's and Mars introduced successful new products with remarkable consistency. Reese's Peanut Butter Cups continued expanding their audience, while brands such as Starburst and Skittles attracted younger consumers through bold flavors, colorful marketing, and constant innovation. The industry was moving forward at full speed. NECCO wasn't. Its products had changed very little since the 19th century. There were occasional flavor additions and redesigned packaging, but the company's identity remained rooted in nostalgia. Management believed that a century of success was proof the formula didn't need to change. For years, that confidence appeared justified. Conversation Hearts still dominated Valentine's Day, and NECCO products remained inexpensive, recognizable, and widely distributed. But popularity can hide structural weakness. The company was becoming increasingly dependent on a single season. By 2007, reality could no longer be ignored. After more than a century of private ownership, the family behind NECCO accepted what had become unavoidable. They could no longer sustain the business. The company was sold to the private equity firm American Capital for approximately $118 million. To employees, customers, and local officials, the acquisition sounded hopeful. New investment, modern facilities, fresh leadership, a chance to restore one of America's oldest manufacturers. Those promises never became the priority. Private equity firms often evaluate businesses differently from the people who built them. Their objective is frequently to improve financial returns over a relatively short period before selling the company again. That approach can involve aggressive cost reductions and asset sales alongside operational changes. Inside NECCO, the transformation was immediate. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs. Departments were consolidated. Marketing budgets shrank. Research and product development received far less attention. Instead of preparing the company for the future, management focused on squeezing as much financial efficiency as possible from existing operations while limiting spending on maintenance and modernization. But one asset attracted more attention than anything happening inside the factory: the Cambridge property. Its location along the Charles River had become extraordinarily valuable. By the late 2000s, developers viewed the land itself as being worth tens of millions of dollars, possibly more than the candy business operating on top of it. In 2009, American Capital sold the property for approximately $54.4 million. For generations of employees, the decision marked the symbolic end of an era. The massive brick factory that had produced billions of candies, survived world wars, and defined the identity of the company was no longer part of NECCO's future. The business was given only 2 years to leave. In 2011, production relocated to a smaller facility in Revere, Massachusetts. Functionally, the move kept the company alive. Operationally, it created a new set of problems. The new facility lacked the scale and efficiency of Cambridge. Equipment that had already aged considerably was transferred into a tighter manufacturing environment. Workers struggled to adapt, production slowed, and maintaining consistent quality became increasingly difficult. For many longtime employees, it felt less like a fresh beginning and more like a company trying to survive on borrowed time. American Capital had already secured much of the value it wanted. The factory itself was no longer the priority. By 2014, another sale followed. American Capital sold NECCO to Atlantic Management for approximately $17.3 million. The contrast was astonishing. Only 7 years earlier, the business had been purchased for $118 million. Now it changed hands for barely 15% of that figure. The company's value had collapsed by roughly 85%. Once again, new ownership spoke confidently about rebuilding the business. Once again, employees were promised investment, modernization, and renewed growth. Inside the factory, those promises remained difficult to see. By 2015, workers described an operation struggling simply to keep production moving. Machines failed with increasing frequency. Conveyor systems jammed unexpectedly. Manufacturing lines sometimes sat idle for hours, while maintenance crews tried to keep aging equipment operational. Many of the machines had been in service for decades. Instead of being replaced, they were repeatedly repaired, creating an environment where breakdowns became part of daily operations rather than exceptional events. Mechanical failures were frustrating. What came next was far more serious. During a 2015 inspection, officials from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health documented numerous sanitation concerns inside the facility. According to inspection findings, inspectors observed issues including water leaks above production areas, condensation near exposed candy, sugar residue, and grease accumulating on floors, evidence of pests, employees failing to consistently follow food handling practices, heavily soiled equipment, and other sanitation deficiencies. The report resulted in multiple violations, and production of certain products was temporarily interrupted while corrective actions were required. For a company whose reputation depended almost entirely on public trust, the findings were deeply damaging. Consumers rarely think about where their candy is manufactured. They simply assume the factory meets basic safety standards. That assumption had suddenly been challenged. According to critics of the company's management, the response focused primarily on addressing the immediate inspection requirements rather than making the substantial investments needed to modernize the aging facility. Comprehensive renovations would have required significant capital. Replacing aging machinery, upgrading production lines, and improving long-term maintenance represented costs ownership appeared reluctant to absorb. Employees grew increasingly frustrated. Some workers, speaking anonymously to local media, described deteriorating conditions inside the plant and mounting pressure to maintain production despite persistent equipment problems. Whether every individual complaint reflected conditions across the entire facility remained difficult to verify, but together they painted the picture of a workforce losing confidence in its own company. Consumers, meanwhile, knew almost nothing about what was happening behind factory walls. Production continued. Candy continued reaching store shelves. From the outside, NECCO still looked like the familiar American brand it had always been. Inside, the cracks were widening. By 2016, regulators were examining additional concerns surrounding manufacturing practices. Reports that some batches of NECCO wafers contained detectable levels of heavy metals, including lead and cadmium, drew increased regulatory attention. The reported levels did not trigger an immediate nationwide recall, but they raised important questions about manufacturing controls and the condition of aging equipment. The possibility that decades-old infrastructure might be contributing to contamination represented exactly the kind of problem a heritage manufacturer could least afford. Regulators required additional testing, stronger quality control measures, and improvements to manufacturing oversight. Rather than bringing an end to the controversy, the dispute became increasingly public. As discussions between regulators and company management continued, media coverage expanded. Food safety websites reported on the issue. Online discussions spread rapidly. Parents who had trusted the brand for generations suddenly found themselves questioning products they had purchased for years without hesitation. Trust, once lost, is remarkably difficult to recover. Sales didn't collapse overnight. Instead, they declined gradually. Retailers began dedicating less shelf space to NECCO products. Some chains questioned whether stocking merchandise associated with ongoing regulatory scrutiny was worth the risk. By 2017, the financial pressure had become severe. Revenue had fallen substantially. The company was operating at a loss. Legal expenses continued mounting. Public confidence weakened, and the Revere factory increasingly resembled a costly burden rather than the foundation of a recovery. Atlantic management reached a familiar conclusion. It was time to sell. Once again, America's oldest candy company was placed on the market. But this time, finding another buyer would prove far more difficult than anyone expected. By 2018, there was little left to hide. Inside the industry, everyone understood the situation. NECCO was running out of time. Atlantic management wanted out, but finding a buyer proved far more difficult than expected. The company approached major confectionery manufacturers, including Hershey's, Mars, and Ferrero, but none showed interest. From the outside, the reasons were obvious. The brand had lost momentum, production problems continued to generate negative headlines, and years of underinvestment had left the business requiring far more capital than most buyers were willing to commit. Then, unexpectedly, another bidder appeared. In March 2018, a little-known investment firm called Round Hill Investments, LLC, stepped forward. Compared to the multinational candy companies that had declined the opportunity, Round Hill was a relatively small player. The firm's public face was C. Dean Metropolis, a businessman associated with several well-known food industry turnarounds. Optimism briefly returned. On May 23, 2018, Round Hill completed the acquisition for approximately $17.3 million. Publicly, the message sounded reassuring. The new owners described themselves as caretakers of an iconic American brand and pledged to preserve more than 170 years of confectionery history. Behind those optimistic statements, however, the company faced an immediate reality. Reviving NECCO required far more than ownership. It required capital. It required modern equipment. It required stable supplier relationships, experienced management, and a detailed long-term strategy. Those resources were in short supply. Within weeks, serious operational problems became impossible to ignore. Then came the decision that effectively ended an era. In July 2018, less than 2 months after purchasing the company, Round Hill announced that the Revere factory would cease operations. Approximately 230 remaining employees were laid off. Production stopped. For the first time since Oliver Chase built his hand-cranked lozenge cutter in 1847, NECCO was no longer manufacturing candy. A company that had survived wars, depressions, changing consumer tastes, and more than a century and a half of American history had reached complete operational silence. The explanation given publicly centered on restructuring and relocating production. The reality was simpler. The turnaround had failed almost before it had begun. By August 2018, the factory stood empty. Production lines that had once manufactured billions of wafers every year sat motionless beneath layers of dust. Offices were abandoned. Loading docks fell quiet. Soon afterward, auction notices appeared. Round Hill entered bankruptcy proceedings, and nearly everything associated with the company was prepared for liquidation. Industrial equipment, manufacturing machinery, inventory, intellectual property, even the trademarks that generations of Americans had grown up with. One by one, pieces of the company were sold to whoever saw value in them. On August 28th, bidders walked through the factory, evaluating what remained. Some examined conveyor systems and industrial mixers. Others calculated the scrap value of aging machinery. Brand specialists focused on something far less tangible: the names: Conversation Hearts, NECCO Wafers, Clark Bars. Those trademarks ultimately found a new owner. Spangler Candy Company, best known for Dum Dums lollipops, acquired several of NECCO's iconic brands for approximately $18.8 million and announced plans to resume production. But there was one important difference. Production would no longer happen in Massachusetts. The company that had helped define New England manufacturing would continue only in name. Its physical home was gone. Its equipment was scattered among other manufacturers, auction buyers, and scrap dealers. For the employees who had spent decades working inside those factories, the ending was especially painful. Hundreds suddenly found themselves unemployed. Many had expected to retire from NECCO. Instead, they watched the company disappear almost overnight. By September 2018, the Revere facility had been stripped of nearly everything. Broken windows overlooked empty production floors. Weeds pushed through cracked pavement. A faded leasing sign hung outside a building that had once represented one of America's oldest continuously operating manufacturers. Looking back, it is tempting to believe NECCO collapsed because consumers stopped liking its candy. That explanation is too simple. The decline had begun decades earlier. By the 1970s, competitors were introducing innovative products, while NECCO relied increasingly on tradition. By the 1990s, brand recognition was masking deeper structural problems. By the early 2000s, the company desperately needed modernization. The warning signs had been visible for years. Private equity ownership did not create every problem, but it dramatically accelerated the consequences. The sale of the Cambridge property generated immediate financial value, yet it also removed the company from the manufacturing ecosystem it had spent generations building. The move to Revere introduced operational challenges that required major investment to solve. Instead, successive owners largely focused on improving short-term financial performance while committing relatively little toward long-term modernization. Each ownership transition left the business weaker than before. By the time Round Hill assumed control in 2018, very little operational strength remained. The company entered bankruptcy only weeks after completing the acquisition. The story of NECCO extends well beyond candy. It offers several enduring lessons. First, history alone cannot sustain a business. A famous brand may attract customers once, but it cannot replace innovation forever. Consumers continually compare products with what exists today, not what existed 50 years ago. Second, valuable assets are not always the same as a valuable business. For years, the Cambridge property appreciated dramatically in value, while the company's manufacturing operations struggled to remain competitive. Eventually, the land became worth more than the enterprise itself. Finally, trust is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. Generations of Americans associated NECCO with reliability and tradition. Once questions emerged about manufacturing standards and product quality, rebuilding that confidence became far harder than producing another batch of candy.